Elijah, the man who made fire fall from heaven. Have you ever imagined witnessing the impossible? Seeing something so impressive that it would change the way you look at life? That's exactly what Elijah did. A man who, alone, stood against a nation immersed in idolatry, challenged kings, confronted false prophets, and finally prayed for fire to fall from heaven, and God answered. Elijah wasn't just a prophet. He was living proof that, with faith, anything is possible. But at the same time, his story also shows us something counterintuitive. Even the greatest heroes of faith face moments of fear, doubt, and retreat. And it's in this contrast between courage and weakness that we find the most profound lessons for our own lives. As someone who dealt with corrupt kings like Ahab and feared figures like Jezebel, Elijah teaches us about the cost of standing firm in the truth. And perhaps the most fascinating fact is that even when fire fell from heaven on Mount Carmel, that wasn't Elijah's greatest victory. The real miracle was his perseverance, his ability to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. And in the end, the question remains: how can we apply this extraordinary faith to our own lives? The answer may be simpler than you think. The confrontation on Mount Carmel. Imagine the scene. The sun blazed high over Mount Carmel, while Elijah stood before a restless crowd. On one side, the prophets of Baal, full of confidence in their idols. On the other, Elijah, alone but convinced of the presence of the true God. The challenge was clear. The God who responded with fire would be the true God. It wasn't just a religious battle. It was a fight for truth in a nation steeped in idolatry. And as intimidating as it was to face 450 prophets, Elijah knew that his strength didn't come from numbers but from God's power. The prophets of Baal began their invocation, shouting, dancing, even cutting themselves in a desperate attempt to make their God send fire. But nothing happened. No flame, no sign. The silence that followed was as deafening as the absence of any response. Elijah, with a tone that mixed humor and irony, suggested that perhaps Baal was sleeping or busy. Elijah's faith was unshakable. He knew that miracles happen when we trust in the impossible and place our faith in something greater than ourselves. Then, it was Elijah's turn. But he didn't just offer a simple prayer. First, he asked that the altar be soaked with water, making the situation even more unlikely. Who would do that in a drought, in a time of scarcity? This was the kind of faith he wanted to demonstrate, that God acts even in the most adverse circumstances. When he prayed, fire from heaven descended with overwhelming intensity, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water. The people, seeing this miracle, bowed down in worship, recognizing, "The Lord is God! The Lord is God!" This moment wasn't just a spectacle of power. It was a call to repentance, an invitation to transformation. Elijah wasn't there to humiliate the prophets of Baal, but to bring the people back to true faith. And deep down, this is a lesson that transcends the ages. In the battles we face today, we must remember that what really matters is our connection with God, not the size of the challenge before us. But Elijah's story doesn't end here. There's much more to learn from his journey, especially when he had to face Jezebel's fury. Jezebel's persecution and Elijah's flight. Right after the victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah didn't have much time to celebrate. Jezebel, King Ahab's wife and one of the most influential figures in Israel's idolatry, didn't take the defeat of her prophets lightly. With a fierce vow, she promised that Elijah would be killed for exposing the weakness of her gods. With that, Elijah fled, driven by fear and physical and spiritual exhaustion. The reality is that no matter how brave we are in some battles, there will always be moments when the weight of responsibility hits us with full force. Elijah ran to the desert, isolating himself from everything and everyone. The feeling of defeat and discouragement was overwhelming. He lay under a broom bush, asking God to let his life end there. This reminds us that even the greatest prophets, those who performed great miracles, have moments of deep vulnerability. But God, in his infinite mercy, didn't leave Elijah in despair. An angel was sent to feed and strengthen the prophet. Sometimes, in our darkest moments, it's important to remember that the solution can be as simple as resting and recharging. With his body and soul rejuvenated, Elijah was guided to Mount Horeb, where he would seek God's direction. This makes us reflect on the importance of seeking spiritual refuge in times of crisis. Today, this may mean setting aside time to meditate, pray, or simply breathe away from the chaos. Elijah's desert symbolizes the moments when we feel alone, but also the opportunity to find clarity and purpose in the silence. And even in the face of such exhaustion, Elijah's mission was far from over. The flight to the desert, which could have seemed like the end of his journey, was actually a new beginning. God had something greater in store for him. Like Elijah, sometimes we need to step back to understand what truly matters and prepare for what's next. But what God would reveal to Elijah on Mount Horeb would completely change his perspective, paving the way for his next great mission. The miracle of the widow of Zarephath. Before the showdown on Mount Carmel and Jezebel's persecution, Elijah had already experienced God's supernatural provision in a unique way. When drought ravaged the land, God sent him to Zarephath, where he met a widow in extreme poverty. The situation was desperate. She and her son were on the brink of death from lack of food. But it was in this scenario of total scarcity that God chose to act miraculously. This episode reminds us that often the greatest miracles happen when we are at our limit. When Elijah asked for a bit of water and a piece of bread, he was met with the brutal reality of famine. The woman only had enough for one last meal. However, Elijah, moved by unshakable faith, told the widow to prepare the food, assuring her that the flour and oil wouldn't run out until the rain returned. This story carries a powerful message about the importance of trusting God even in the hardest times. In times of scarcity, whether of resources, faith, or hope, divine provision always shows up when we make room for it. The miracle that happened in the widow's home is a clear example that God is faithful to his promises, but he also expects a step of faith from us. The woman didn't know what would happen when she obeyed Elijah's request, but she chose to trust anyway. And just like her, we often find ourselves in situations where taking the first step seems impossible, but it's precisely in that act of faith that God moved. The house that was on the verge of death became a place of life and abundance. What started as a casual encounter between a prophet and an ordinary woman turned into a testimony of how even small faith can lead to extraordinary results. This is one of Elijah's greatest legacies, showing that God's intervention doesn't depend on circumstances but on the willingness of hearts to trust in him. And that faith would be tested again when Elijah faced the biggest decision of his life. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like the video. Elijah and Elisha, a discipleship and the prophetic succession. In the midst of so many supernatural experiences, Elijah knew that his time on earth wouldn't last forever. But before departing, he was given the mission of preparing his successor, Elisha. The relationship between Elijah and Elisha is one of the most beautiful examples of discipleship in Scripture. Elijah not only performed extraordinary miracles, but also made sure to pass on his knowledge and faith to the next generation. This teaches us an important truth. No one fulfills their mission alone. We must always think about who will come after us. Elisha's calling was a remarkable event. Elijah passed by him and threw his cloak over him, a symbolic gesture that represented the transfer of authority and responsibility. Elisha, in turn, didn't hesitate to leave everything behind to follow his mentor. Elisha's attitude shows us the value of total surrender when we're called to a mission. Often, we must let go of comfort, certainty, and even expectations to follow a greater purpose. During their time together, Elijah invested in Elisha, teaching him not only about the practical aspects of the prophetic office, but also about the importance of total dependence on God. Their relationship wasn't just one of master and apprentice, it was a true spiritual partnership. Elijah knew that the legacy he would leave wasn't just miracles but people who would carry on his work. And Elisha was eager to learn every detail, ready to be God's instrument. When the time for Elijah's departure finally came, Elisha made a bold request, a double portion of his mentor's spirit. Elijah, recognizing the seriousness of the request, replied that it wasn't up to him but to God. And as they walked and talked, a chariot of fire descended from heaven, taking Elijah away. This event didn't just mark the end of a ministry but the beginning of a new era with Elisha. But Elijah's story still holds one last great chapter. His prayer that changed the climate of a nation. The prayer that stopped the rain. Elijah wasn't only known for his dramatic confrontations or his visible miracles. He was also a man of deep prayer. One of the most striking episodes of his life was his prayer for rain, or rather, for the lack of it. As part of God's judgment against the idolatry and rebellion of Israel, Elijah prayed for the rain to stop, and for 3.5 years, the skies remained closed. This is a powerful lesson about the impact of intercession and the authority God can grant to his servant. After the great confrontation on Mount Carmel, Elijah prayed again, this time asking for the return of the rain. He climbed to the top of the mountain, bent down with his face between his knees, and prayed fervently. As he prayed, he sent his servant to look at the sky, expecting to see some sign of rain. 6 times the servant returned, saying there was nothing. Yet Elijah didn't give up. On the 7th time, the servant saw a small cloud, the size of a man's hand. That was enough for Elijah to know that God had answered his prayer. This story reveals a fundamental principle of faith: perseverance. Elijah didn't pray just once and waited passively. He persisted, even when the initial signs seemed discouraging. How many times in our lives do we give up on the 6th attempt, without waiting for the 7th? Elijah's prayer didn't just bring rain back to the land. It also renewed the people's hope. Intercession is a powerful weapon, and like Elijah, we are called to pray with conviction and expectation, trusting that God is in control of the times and seasons. Elijah, the man who stopped the rain, teaches us that faith isn't just believing when things are evident but persisting when everything seems against us. The small cloud turned into a storm of blessings, and the people finally saw the drought end. But this story of prayer and miracle leads us to another, even more surprising: the fire that fell from heaven, confirming Elijah's ministry in a way that no one would ever forget. The fire from heaven, Elijah's confirmation as God's prophet. If there were any doubts about Elijah's prophetic calling, they were completely dispelled when God answered his prayer with fire from heaven. This event wasn't just a demonstration of power, it was a confirmation that Elijah was in tune with the divine will. On Mount Carmel, before a nation torn between the worship of Baal and faith in the God of Israel, Elijah stood as a lone voice, but a firm one. His prayer for fire was a bold request, a proof that God was on his side. The fire that came down from heaven consumed not only the sacrifice but also the wood, the stones, and the water around the altar. This was an undeniable sign that Elijah's God was the one true God. The impact of this display was so great that the entire people fell to their knees, proclaiming, "The Lord is God." But beyond the spectacle, there was a profound message. When we are aligned with God's will, He responds in ways we cannot predict. Elijah knew this moment was crucial for Israel's spiritual restoration. However, the fire from heaven wasn't just to convince others. It was also a confirmation for Elijah himself. He had gone through immense challenges, from Jezebel's persecution to isolation in the desert. The fire symbolized that even amid so many struggles, God was present and responded with power. How many times in our lives do we go through moments of doubt and need a fire from heaven to reignite our faith? God's fire isn't something we can control, but it's a response to our faith and obedience. And this flame of power and truth that descended on Mount Carmel reminds us that Elijah's God is still the same today. But Elijah's story doesn't end here. He would still have a final encounter with God, where his ministry would be concluded in a way few could imagine. The end of Elijah's ministry, his ascension to heaven in a chariot of fire. Elijah's ministry didn't end with an ordinary death. In fact, his departure was as supernatural as his entire life. God, who had always been with him in every miracle, chose to take him in a unique way, in a chariot of fire. This event wasn't just the conclusion of his mission on earth. It was also a final declaration of God's favor over his life. Elijah had fulfilled his mission with faithfulness, facing kings, prophets, and crowds, and now he would be taken directly to heaven. Before his ascension, Elijah and Elisha walked together one last time. Elisha, knowing that his mentor was about to depart, asked for a double portion of his spirit. Elijah, with humility, said that this would be granted only if Elisha saw him being taken. And so it happened. The chariot of fire appeared, separating the two, and Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. This impressive moment wasn't just a dramatic ending. It was a reminder that the legacy of a man of God never ends with his departure. Elijah's ascension was a symbol of God's ongoing power and the hope that those who follow him have a destiny beyond this life. Elijah didn't experience death. He was taken directly into God's presence, something that only a few in history have had the privilege of experiencing. This makes us think about the legacy we leave. What are we building that will last beyond our lives? Elijah teaches us that the true legacy is spiritual, something that passes from generation to generation. And so, Elijah's ministry ended, but his impact continued. Elisha, his disciple, took up the mantle and performed even greater miracles, as he had requested. Even in the lives of Jesus and John the Baptist, the spirit of Elijah continued to be mentioned. This is the kind of legacy that endures. When we are faithful to the mission God has given us, our influence extends beyond our time on earth. And that is exactly the kind of legacy Elijah left. But what about you? What will your legacy be? Elijah left us an invaluable inheritance, unwavering faith and the courage to face the greatest challenges, even when the world seems against us. But what about you? How can you apply all this to your life? Have you ever stopped for a moment and thought about the Jezebels you face daily? Perhaps they are challenges at work, in your family, or even internal battles. Elijah's story invites us to act with boldness, to trust God completely, and to expect Him to respond with power. Now, think carefully. How would your life be if you had this unwavering faith? If you faced your problems with the certainty that the God of fire is by your side? Elijah shows us that true faith isn't something passive, but something that moves mountains and makes the impossible happen. Want to learn more about this kind of faith? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, you will continue learning how to apply God's teachings in your everyday life and transform it, just as Elijah transformed the history of a nation. If you want to continue learning from these transformative stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll stay updated on each new teaching that can impact your life and your relationship with God. Let's continue this journey of faith together.